Shalom from Jerusalem. The war between Hamas and Israel is not confined to these two parties. It has regional implications for Lebanon and Syria, Egypt and Jordan, and the repercussions do not stop there, with great power competition reflected in American military and diplomatic moves and in Russian and Chinese countermoves. What is the geostrategic dimension of the war, which erupted on October 7th, of course? How is it helping shape the war? And is the war going to have a significant impact on it? To help us analyze it, we're joined by Ambassador John Bolton, who is the former U.S. National Security Advisor. Thank you for joining us, sir. Also joining us is Spain's former National Security Advisor, Dr. Rafael Bardaji. And with us here in the studio is also our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us the latest on the various developments from a geostrategic perspective.
So, Jonathan, as you said in your introduction, the war is being conducted or has an impact on three spheres. The inner sphere is obviously the Israel-Hamas collision. The middle sphere is the regional one, with Egypt and Jordan fearing an influx of refugees from either Gaza or the West Bank, or demonstrations in the Hashemite kingdom, and therefore wishing to contain the conflict. And what we see in the outer circle or outer sphere is American movements first, the two carrier strike forces moving to the Eastern Mediterranean, President Biden coming over, convening a conference, and as is the laws of nature, there is a counterforce. The China-Russia axis, along with other anti-Israel nations and organizations. How it will all come out will be seen following the Israeli incursion into Gaza, ground incursion, unless, which right now seems improbable, unless Hamas gives up and its leadership uprooted, going out of Gaza and somewhere else, such as Qatar or Turkey, the way Yasser Arafat left Beirut for northern Lebanon and then to Tunis in 1982.
One very crucial point, obviously omitted in this discussion, is a very big actor, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been operating behind the scenes, and not only behind the scenes, but via its proxy throughout the region to try and destabilize matters, and obviously the extension thereof is the matter that occurred, which ultimately brought about the massacre by the Islamist terrorists emanating from the Gaza Strip upon southern Israel. And another factor, there was a certain American vacuum, at least a perception thereof, here among many partners in the region, which ultimately allowed China and Russia to try and fill that void, and also emboldening bad actors in this region. Ambassador Bolton, I'd like to start with you. How do you currently see the scope of things?
Well, I see what began on October the 7th as part of a larger confrontation across the region. And I really think that the best way to look at this is that what happened on that date and what's going on now is not a Hamas attack on Israel. This is an Iranian attack on Israel being carried out by the surrogate Hamas as a terrorist group. We don't know the full implications of what Iran has in mind here. We don't know whether this is a one-off proposition or whether we are seeing implemented what's called the Ring of Fire strategy put together by Qasem Soleimani, the now deceased head of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. We don't know whether they're willing to play for the ultimate stakes here, but certainly this is the first move, and it may well be that they want to get Israel pulled into an extensive incursion in Gaza with 100, 150,000, maybe more troops involved, and then unleash Hezbollah from the north. Maybe Syria is going to be involved. Russia's playing a very curious role here. The other day, they criticized Israel for bombing the Damascus and Aleppo airports. for a decade or more, Russia had tolerated Iranian strikes against, Israeli strikes against Iran, convoys taking weapons to Hezbollah and the government of Syria, just so long as Israel deconflicted with Russian forces there. Now the Russians are suddenly concerned about Syrian sovereignty. So I don't know what that portends, but I do think that really this has global implications. I think China's working behind the scenes. I think they've coordinated with Iran. I don't see the way ahead clearly. I don't think we can really predict what the next move is, but the potential is there for a very large expansion of this. In a sense, it's not an expansion of all, because if Iran really is pulling the puppet strings, they're the ones who expanded the war when they unleashed Hamas.
Obviously, these activities which you're speaking about have far-reaching implications for not only the region but the entire world. The economic ramifications of are yet to be seen. But I'd like to quote Brigadier General Daniel Hagari, the spokesman of the IDF, who reinforces what you noted about the fact that Hezbollah attacked Israel once again this morning and during the day a couple of times. And then he highlighted Hezbollah carried out a number of shooting attacks in order to distract from our war efforts in the south, namely the Gaza Strip, under Iranian instruction and with Iranian support. Dr. Rafael Bardaji, obviously this is not a new phenomenon, that Iran is obviously pulling the strings and acting in its own interests, which ultimately seek to establish regional domination as a first stage. The biggest obstacle for that is namely the state of Israel.
Yep, I think if I can use a metaphor, I would say that Israel is suffering from a kind of octopus that is trying to asphyxiate the country. The tentacles can be dealt with. I mean, it could be Hezbollah, Hamas, the Palestinian Jihad, but the head, we know where it is, and we know it's Iran. So the traditional strategy has been to keep the conflict with Iran limited to the regional proxies. But I don't see any long-term solution for Israel unless it addresses for now, at the end of the process, what Iran is doing and why is behind everything that we are seeing, unfortunately, such an horrific attack on Israel.
Indeed. Well, of course, we have the deployment of the Gerald R. Ford in the Eastern Mediterranean, not far from Cyprus, that is, and we have the Dwight Eisenhower, the USS Dwight Eisenhower, currently en route to the Mediterranean Sea. It will be stationed in the Adriatic, not far from Italy, that is. Nevertheless, it will make its assets available also if the region here in the Middle East conflaggers. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the posture, the different deployments. Where are we at this stage?
Well, Israel is prepared, even though, of course, if you are going to disperse your forces into three theaters rather than one, it would be more difficult. The Israeli defense doctrine has always been offense on one theater, defense on the other one or two. When it was Jordan and Syria, beyond the defense, when you hit Egypt, this was in the 50s and the 60s. I'm not sure that two carrier task forces in the Mediterranean deter Iran more than the same number of units in the Persian Gulf did either in the 1980s during Operation Prayer Mantis, or whatever it was called, the reflagging operation, or even more recently, when there was tension in the Hormuz Straits, and the U.S. sent its forces, a show of force, but with real force behind it. This was more concerning to the Iranians. But they understand that there is a possibility that what started in Gaza may then flare up in Lebanon, and the third step, either by their own initiative or by Israel's, could engulf them. It seems that right now, at least by public posture, they are trying to distance themselves from what is happening. Obviously, behind the scenes, intelligence-wise, and I well remember when Ambassador Bolton wrote a piece a few days before Israel struck the North Korean reactor in Syria. In late August of 2007, Ambassador Bolton wrote a very prescient column in which he warned that either Iran or North Korea is probably behind nuclear activities in Syria. You do remember that, John, don't you?
Indeed. Well, Ambassador
Right.
Bolton,
Unfortunately.
Indeed. Unfortunately, you were also right about it. So, when we're looking at the current situation, however, and we're seeing that whatever Iran is saying is obviously rhetoric, it's not really connected necessarily to its activities in the field, since we do see its militias, various proxies throughout the region, from Yemen through Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, preparing for an all-out conflagration. We're also seeing the Hashd-e-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, amassing troops on the border with Jordan, among others. To what degree are all those deployments correlated in a scheme that intends to challenge, first and foremost, the state of Israel, but ultimately the United States presence here in the region?
Well, I think it's a very high probability. I like Rafael's metaphor of the octopus with Iran at the head of it. Look, this conflict began with a massive intelligence failure on the part of both Israel and the United States. And down the road, we're going to have a forensic examination of that. But I think right now, the main thing we need from our intelligence agencies on an urgent basis, and I hope and assume they're doing this, is to tell us what else they think they missed, to see if there's information we had but didn't understand or didn't examine carefully enough, or any new information that's come in that may give us some indication of how the Iranians see this playing out. I think right now, Tehran is trying to have the best of both worlds, saying with one voice, well, it's just purely local conditions and the poor Palestinians and so on, while at the same time threatening the United States, threatening Israel, to try and intimidate the government in Israel in particular from going into Gaza. I don't think we will really know until the Gaza incursion actually begins, and we see what probably Hezbollah does next. And that's something that these two carrier battle groups, I do think they're intended to deter Hezbollah in particular. And they have capabilities that are quite substantial. The issue is whether Iran believes that Biden is serious about this, and when it comes right down to it, he would step up and authorize the use of force to provide air cover for Israel, or whatever might be necessary. And that is where I am worried. We'll see with President Biden's visit to Israel on Wednesday. He's going on to Amman, Jordan, as I understand it, to meet with Arab leaders. And I think Israel should welcome the political support. I just hope this doesn't have as a kind of hidden agenda trying to prevent or delay as long as possible the incursion into Gaza. The hostages are more at risk every day that goes by. And frankly, I think there's a risk for the Israeli forces of losing their combat edge if they're on the verge of going in and yet not actually doing it for too long. So I think whatever the consultations that are going to occur tomorrow, and again, make no mistake, I think it's an important political symbol, a brave political symbol for the president to go to Israel. I think it ought to be to provide support for what Israel has said its legitimate objective is, which is not just responding to the Hamas threat, but eliminating it.
Indeed, eliminating both its military infrastructure as well as its government capabilities in the Gaza Strip, basically distancing it from the capacity to hold any type of territory. Dr. Rafael Bardaji, your take on that?
Yeah, well, I would like to say that it's always comfortable to believe that you have the U.S. cavalry on your back to come and rescue you from any situation. And the carriers and the battle groups from the U.S. Navy are very important. But I think, as far as I understand, the Biden administration, they have a dual purpose. One is to deter, probably, Hezbollah from taking any aggressive action in the current circumstances, but also, and logically, and in coherence with the political approach of the Biden administration to Israel, will be also to restrain the use of force and violence to be employed by Israel in taking Gaza. So it's a dual swords edge, and And so I wouldn't be so happy as many spectators, analysts are commenting on the American military deployment, because I think has some gray areas, and we don't know yet. We will see after the president goes to Jordan, and let's see how evolves the political situation. But it's not clear cut to me.
I would like to actually ask you, Ambassador Bolton, with regard to in every war and every crisis, there are also opportunities. Do you see opportunities rising from this current state of play, particularly or even potentially, to see the capacity of Israel with U.S. support or potentially even the United States in a combined task force dealing with Iran's nuclear infrastructure?
Well, I think that's a possibility. And I do think Iran has to pay a physical price for supporting Hamas in the October 7 attack. Because until now, and with limited respect to Hezbollah and activity in the north of Israel, Iran's not paying any price. Its surrogates are paying a price and will pay a much heavier price, I think. But Iran itself needs to learn the lesson here. But to me, this goes to the conceptual framing of this attack. I mean, I think Hamas hopes to spread within the Arab world antagonism toward Israel, trying to break the possibility of reestablishing or establishing diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia and other countries. And so that's why if the White House and Europe understood this as an Iranian attack on Israel, I think you'd have a better argument with the leadership in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Arab countries that this is a time not to be pressuring Israel from protecting itself against Hamas terrorism, but helping Israel work against the Iranian threat. So if there were a way to explain the current situation as caused by Iran, which I think is the fact, perhaps this could help advance Israeli ties with the Gulf Arabs and others in the region even more than we've seen so far. Certainly, it's in Iran's interest to disrupt ties between Israel and the Arab world and the broader Muslim world. And I think trying to do a little jujitsu here and turn this against the Iranians should be what we're trying to do. I'm not underestimating the difficulty, but I think reality is on the side of arguing that the troublemaker here is Iran.
Indeed. I'd like to hear also what you have to say about this, Dr. Bardaji, but I'd like also to note the fact that Qatar is also utilized within this context as the mouthpiece of the Islamist Hamas organization. The Hamas's political leadership is in Doha proper, where after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Doha, obviously the Iranian foreign minister who visited Beirut then traveled to Doha. We spoke about this. He met there with his counterpart, with the Amir, as well as with the leadership of Hamas, and has been utilizing its mouthpiece Al Jazeera in order to not only attack Israel, but also attack the United States in that context, which should be highlighted under the Biden administration. Obviously, Qatar was designated as a major non-NATO ally, which is quite surprising and quite concerning nonetheless. Dr. Bardaji, your take on that?
Well, I cannot agree more than with what John said about Iran being behind everything. But I think there must be some legal ways in the United States, since citizens of America has been killed or kidnapped by Hamas nowadays, to start a process of extradition of the leadership in Qatar, of Hamas. There must be some lawyers that can put and advance such a way. I think there are too many fronts here, including the legal, that should be exploited in the benefit of the security of Israel in the near future. But again, when the narrative from Israel is that Hamas is ISIS, I understand because of the brutality of attacks. But Hezbollah is no less ISIS than Hamas. And if everything becomes ISIS, nothing is ISIS anymore. I think that's misguiding, because what John said, it's putting Iran as a backbone of everything that's happening in the region, will bring much more support for Israel in the region and outside the region. So we need to avoid mistakes of denouncing the wrong enemies and be clear about what the real enemies are, which to me is Iran, clearly.
Completely agree with that statement. And in broader context, obviously, when we're looking at the Islamic Republic of Iran, we understand what it is representing. Unfortunately, it's able to deceive time and again the West. But nevertheless, Mr. Oren, you had a question that you wanted to raise?
Yes, Ambassador Bolton, drawing on your vast experience in the national security establishment in Washington, and mindful of the fact that next week we are marking the 40th anniversary of the Beirut barracks disaster, when 2041 Marines and other servicemen lost their lives in a terror act, after the Reagan administration authorized the shelling of Druze and Syrian proxy positions in Suqr Rarb. And then, of course, Reagan withdrew the fleet. Is the American public, is Congress going to back up the executive branch if it comes to a shooting war involving the U.S. in the Levant?
Well, I think it's certainly something that the administration needs to think through more carefully than it has done, because its instinctive reaction is to try and get de-escalation without thinking about what the potential consequences of that would be. If Iran and Hamas basically get away with this, it's simply an incentive to do more and worse in the future. And I do think that in Iran and in Hezbollah, the memory of the bombing of the Marine barracks, which was preceded a few months before that in 1983 by the attack on the U.S. embassy in Beirut, was that the U.S. pulled its forces out. So that's part of I think, why they also picked the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which greatly surprised Israel and everybody else. And so if they believe that Biden is not prepared to take strong action, that's an incentive for them to continue. I think support for Israel at the moment is at its peak in the United States. There are disturbing polls that show support for Israel is quite low, actually, among younger Americans. A poll just came out yesterday. I have to say I was stunned and disturbed by that, but that's what the poll shows. So all of this, to me, argues for Israel, notwithstanding the bigger picture, but argues with respect to the situation in Gaza to move quickly, to do what they can to try and rescue the 199 hostages, as Israel now counts it, including maybe 15 to 20 Americans and others, to go after the Hamas leadership and to do what Israel said it was going to do in 2006 in the war against Hezbollah, but didn't, which is finish Hamas. Obviously, be careful of the civilians. I have faith in Israel's military and civilian government, as I do in the U.S., to follow the doctrines that we're taught about respecting civilian life, but also to mount an effective information campaign internationally about Hamas terrorizing its own citizens by using them as human shields and the like. I just think the longer the incursion into Gaza is put off, the harder it's going to be for Israel's forces, the bloodier it may be. And the bigger excuse it gives, invalid though it may be, but the bigger excuse it gives Israel's opponents in the West to try and pressure Israel to stop. Let's not discount what I think both Rafael and I have been concerned with for a number of years. Anti-Semitism is growing in Europe and the United States. It's sad to have to say that, but I'm afraid that's the reality. I just would not give more time than is at all possible to allow that to develop.
It's not growing faster than migration, that's for sure. Dr. Bardaji, your take on it?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think the faster the IDF acts, the better for Israel. No, anti-Semitism is linked to mass migration in Europe, and we have seen the demonstration in favor of Hamas in the last day, unfortunately. And the longer it takes for Israel to clear up the Gaza Strip, the harder it's going to be politically and diplomatically for Israel. So I think for the long term and the effectiveness of the operation, the sooner the better.
Indeed.
But there is a problem. Yes, both of our guests are obviously right. Memories fade very quickly. And the searing images of October the 7th are now juxtaposed with what is happening to civilians in Gaza. But there is a price to be paid with Israel long being portrayed as the victor now being portrayed as the victim. People, nations, organizations should fear Israel, not have mercy on it.
Well, there is a contradiction in those statements, of course, but the complications that we're talking about are also rooted in the wokeness in Western society these days. We're drawing near to the end of the program. In one sentence, if you made, Ambassador Bolton, could you sum up where should we look at, what should we focus on in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think the operation in Gaza is going to be the center of attention for Israel, and particularly its military in the near term. I understand that, and it's entirely appropriate, and Godspeed, and hope that the casualties are minimal. But I think the government of Israel needs to keep this larger picture in mind, presenting all the evidence they can find from seized Hamas documents, computers, the like, about Iran's involvement. The more people in America and Europe understand this is an Iranian problem, the more support Israel will have.
Dr. Bardaji?
I think that the political blaming game has already started, unfortunately, in Israel. And I don't want to alleviate the responsibility of the government, of the intelligence, and the military, but I think it has been a failure of the whole society that in the last year has become complacent and believing that Israel can live as any globalized, prosperous democracy in the world, despite being surrounded by barbarians. And I think this has been a reality shock that all the country, all the nation, all the people has to reflect on, not only the leadership, but the responsibility for any single civilian in Israel as well. No? And that's the only way that Israel will come out with a long-term solution for the problem.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Ambassador John Bolton, Dr. Rafael Bardaji, and Mr. Amir Oren for taking part in this panel. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.